The Gulfstream Evan Raw had spent 6 weeks bringing back to life gleamed beneath the hangar lights as he placed the invoice on the table. The executives laughed and said they had no intention of paying it. They thought a worn-down, solitary mechanic would stay quiet to protect his reputation. Evan did not argue. He reached into his pocket, took out his certified specialist identification, placed it beside the hangar key, and walked out without a word. 10 minutes later, Vivian Ashcroft ordered the jet prepared for departure. But every pilot who approached the aircraft stepped back, opened the maintenance log, and said the same thing. Without Evan's signature, no one was flying. If you believe honesty is always worth the price, stay until the end and watch how the truth rises into the sky. The rain was still hammering the runway at Blackridge Business Aviation Airfield when Evan Raw drove his pickup through the security gate. It was that cold Carolina rain that fell sideways and made everything around it look temporary. He had received the call at 3 a.m. from a man named Miles Voss, the operations director of Ashcroft Meridian Holdings. Miles described the job in 4 clipped sentences, as if he were reading from an internal memo. It involved a Gulfstream 550, the private jet of the late Conrad Ashcroft. The aircraft had been grounded for nearly 2 years after a combined electrical and hydraulic system failure that no one had properly documented, and no one had been in a hurry to repair. 3 major maintenance firms had told Ashcroft's aviation team that the waiting time would be measured in months. Miles explained that the company did not have months. A final merger deal was closing in 6 weeks, and the jet had to be flight ready before then. Evan asked 2 questions: the date of the last known maintenance and the condition of the hydraulic lines. Then he said he would come inspect the aircraft before agreeing to anything. What he found inside Hangar 7 made him stand still for a long moment while his flashlight cut through the darkness. The Gulfstream had not simply been parked and forgotten. Someone had worked on it. Someone who understood the general layout of an aircraft but not the principles behind it. Then that person had abandoned the repair halfway through, as if something more urgent, or more convenient, had pulled them away. Wiring harnesses had been disconnected and left that way. A hydraulic accumulator had been replaced with a unit that had no traceable part number. Entire sections were missing from the maintenance logs, sections that should have covered the previous 30 months of operation. Evan had seen deferred maintenance before. He had seen aircraft pushed beyond service intervals by operators who trusted luck more than procedure. But this was different. This looked as though someone had deliberately made the work harder to trace. Miles Voss arrived at the hangar 20 minutes later in a suit that cost more than Evan's last monthly bank payment. He laid out the terms with the smooth confidence of a man used to people agreeing before the conversation was over. The contract covered parts, labor, and a completion bonus if Evan returned the aircraft to service on time. Miles spoke the amount aloud in a tone meant to sound generous rather than transactional. Evan asked for the complete maintenance records. Every single one, including any work orders from outside vendors. Miles said he would have someone gather whatever existed. That was not the same as saying the records existed. The conversation ended with Miles telling Evan that the job simply needed to get the aircraft back into the air. The previous repair only needed to be finished. Evan should not let paperwork interfere with the practical side of the matter. Evan was still crouched beneath the forward avionics bay when a second set of footsteps echoed through the hangar, lighter and more measured. He looked up and saw Vivian Ashcroft standing in the doorway, her coat still damp from the rain. She was 38 and carried herself with the controlled composure of someone taught from childhood never to let a room know when she had been shaken. She studied him with the guarded skepticism of a person who had received too many professional opinions and had stopped fully trusting any of them. She asked whether he could do what the other firms had refused to do. Evan slowly stood, wiped his hands on a rag, and told her he could not promise the aircraft would be ready in 6 weeks. He could only promise he would not leave the hangar until it was safe. Her expression belonged to a woman deciding whether his answer was a refusal or a warning. She said nothing before turning back toward the rain. But Nora called as Evan was locking his pickup. Her voice carried that particular mix of lightness and worry teenagers use when they want to ask something difficult without admitting they are asking. Evan told his daughter the job looked big. He told her he would let her know how things went. He said nothing about the foreclosure notice lying on his desk at home, or about how few weeks remained before the bank's patience ran out. He drove away from Blackridge knowing the work was 3 times larger than Miles had described, knowing he needed every dollar from the contract on time, and knowing that none of that changed what he would require before putting his signature on anything. It was only when he removed the panel beneath the main avionics rack and lifted it away that he found it. A component had been installed where a different one should have been. Its serial number matched no manufacturer catalog he had ever seen, and it occupied a position in the system that controlled the aircraft's flight surfaces. Lena Brooks arrived the next morning with a hard case full of diagnostic equipment, and the particular look she wore when she had already decided the job would be worse than advertised but had come anyway. She had worked beside Evan for 11 years. She knew his methods the way musicians know the tempo of a conductor, and she had enough experience with avionics anomalies to understand that an unregistered serial number on a flight control component was not a clerical mistake. It was either incompetence or something far worse. They brought in 2 more technicians, both certified, both trusted. The 4 of them divided the aircraft into zones and began working systematically from nose to tail, cataloging every anomaly, every missing log entry, and every component that did not match the documentation. Miles began delaying parts approvals during the first week. Evan responded by using his personal line of credit to order the components that could not wait: hydraulic seals, wiring harness sections, and a replacement pressurization controller the aircraft desperately needed. Every time Evan submitted a progress report describing a new system failure discovered during inspection, Miles acknowledged it with language that framed the findings as irritating details rather than safety problems. The reports that reached Vivian were reduced to single-paragraph summaries portraying Evan as over budget and behind schedule. On the 9th day, she called the hangar to say concerns had reached her about the pace of the work. Evan told her the pace was being set by what he found, not by what anyone expected him to find. If she wanted to discuss specifics, he would lay every unedited inspection report in front of her. She came that same afternoon and found him lying on his back beneath a cable channel, taking apart a connector with his bare hands because the torque felt wrong. She watched him work for several minutes without saying anything. When he sat up and showed her the connector, the internal contact was bent in a way that would have passed a visual inspection but eventually caused an intermittent autopilot failure. She did not apologize for her earlier tone, but she did not repeat it either. She was beginning to notice, completely indifferent to the fact that she was the person paying him. It was a quality she rarely encountered, and she was not sure whether she liked it, though she could not find a reason to object to it. Lena had been running the unregistered serial number through every available database since the 2nd day. On the 12th day, she found it. The component had been supplied by a company called Wingard Air Supply, a firm registered 3 years earlier. During its short existence, Wingard had billed Ashcroft Meridian's aviation division more than $4 million for parts. Every purchase order, every approval signature, every payment record led back to one name. Lena printed the documents and brought them to Evan the way she always brought him findings that changed the shape of a problem. Without drama, without comment, just papers and silence so he could read. Inside the forward cabin, while recalibrating cockpit instruments, Evan noticed a photograph tucked into the side pocket of the pilot seat. Conrad Ashcroft stood beside the jet on a sunny taxiway, one arm around a younger Vivian. Both were squinting into the light. Evan put the photograph back exactly as he had found it. On the instrument panel, a small mechanical clock with cracked glass had been left in place by every technician who had worked on the aircraft before him. Evan carefully wiped its face with a soft cloth before moving to the next step in his sequence. Lena's voice was quiet when she told him which system the unregistered component controlled: the steering and flight control assembly. A failure in that position, she said, could leave the pilot unable to control the aircraft at any altitude. Evan submitted a formal request the next morning to replace the entire flight control assembly. Miles rejected it before noon. The schedule did not allow for a full assembly replacement, Miles explained in a message routed through Vivian's assistant. The component in question had been approved by a certified engineer whose documentation was already in the file. Evan pulled the engineer's name from the file, checked the certification records, and discovered that the man had left the company 14 months before the date appearing beside his signature. Someone had used his documentation after he was gone. Evan photographed the discrepancy, recorded it in his personal log, and kept working. Because people who falsify documents do not slow down when they are suspected. They accelerate. 3 days later, Evan discovered that an addendum to his original contract had been altered. The delivery date, originally described as a target, had been rewritten as a mandatory deadline. A penalty clause tied to it allowed Ashcroft Meridian to withhold the entire final payment if the aircraft was not delivered by that date. Evan had initialed no such change. He pulled his electronic copy of the original and filed both documents together. Vivian came to the hangar at 9 that evening, running on 4 hours of sleep and the specific tension of someone who had been told 2 contradictory things about the same situation and had not yet decided which to believe. Miles had told her Evan was threatening to delay delivery unless he received payment beyond the original contract. He said the delays were deliberate leverage and that the company should consider legal action if Evan did not comply by the end of the week. She said all of it directly, standing in the middle of the hangar with the aircraft looming between them, large and motionless. Evan listened without interrupting. Then he reached into his work bag, took out a single bolt, and placed it on the tool cabinet between them. He told her to compare it with the part number listed on the latest Wingard Air Supply invoice for that assembly. The bolt came from the aircraft's steering control assembly. When Vivian opened the invoice and looked at the part description, the specifications did not match what she held in her hand. She said nothing for a moment, and Evan did not press her. He understood the difference between a person weighing the consequences and a person looking for a reason to reject them. Miles appeared in the hangar within 15 minutes, which meant someone had called him. He explained to Vivian that minor component substitutions were standard practice, that the parts were functionally equivalent, and that Evan was exaggerating a routine purchasing deviation to create the appearance of a safety crisis. He said it with the ease of someone who had spoken a version of that sentence many times before. Then he turned to Evan and said quietly enough that Vivian did not fully hear him that a man with a foreclosure notice on his property was not in the strongest position to fight a company with 40 lawyers. Evan nodded once and went back to work. That evening, he copied every file, photograph, and data record he had gathered onto 3 separate drives kept in 3 different locations. Vivian returned alone at 11:30 with 2 cups of coffee. For a while they sat on the steps of the maintenance ladder and did not talk about the aircraft. She asked about his daughter. He said Nora was ready to be somewhere new. He asked how long her father had owned the jet. She said, "As long as I can remember," and her voice broke in a way she did not try to hide. By morning, every Wingard Air Supply file had been deleted from the company's maintenance server. The deletion confirmed what Evan and Lena already suspected. And because Lena had expected it, she had already cloned the relevant server directories onto an encrypted external drive that she kept inside her jacket pocket. The next morning, she spread printouts across a folding table and began cross-checking serial numbers, datasheets, and installation records with the methodical patience of someone who understands that evidence only matters if the chain is unbroken. While she worked, Evan found a certified flight control assembly from a decommissioned aircraft at a salvage facility in Tennessee. He verified its certification lineage from the original manufacturer to its last recorded inspection, then wired the deposit from his personal account because Miles had stopped approving any expense over $1,000 without a 48-hour review. From the outside, the final 2 weeks of work did not look dramatic. Bench calibration, system integration tests, ground power checks, the slow confirmation that every repaired system interacted correctly with every other system. But every task carried a different weight because everyone in that hangar knew someone had cut corners on this aircraft before, and the consequences would not fall on the person who had done it. The morning the engines first turned over, the sound rolled across the hangar floor and climbed the walls. 2 technicians actually stopped and stood there listening. Lena allowed herself one satisfied breath before picking up her tablet again. Vivian arrived without warning while the auxiliary power unit was still running. She stopped for a moment at the hangar entrance without stepping inside, as if she needed time before allowing herself to be fully present. When she walked over and placed one hand on the lower edge of the fuselage, Evan recognized the gesture and did not interrupt it. She thanked him in a voice that had nothing to do with professional courtesy. It was the tone people use when speaking about something that cannot be fully expressed and yet must still be spoken. Miles was already moving before Evan had finished explaining that the inspection was not complete, that final system verification remained, and that the origin of every flight-critical component needed independent confirmation before any airworthiness sign-off. Miles stepped forward with a delivery schedule printed on company letterhead and explained that the merger deadline was fixed, and that the aircraft would be returned to flight operations by morning. Evan said the inspection deadlines were fixed too, and that they were determined by safe operation, not by a business deal. That evening, without Evan's knowledge, Miles instructed a technician to return a box of old components to Wingard's storage area inside the hangar, placing them so they could later be presented as unauthorized parts purchased by Evan himself. The technician followed the instruction and asked no questions, which was a pattern of behavior Miles had cultivated for years. Evan submitted the completed invoice the next morning. $240,000. It was itemized by labor, approved parts, funds he had personally advanced, and the completion bonus promised in the original contract. Miles called a meeting with the legal team before lunch. When it ended, Evan was informed that Ashcroft Meridian was withholding final payment pending an investigation into alleged contract violations, including a deadline he had never agreed to and parts he had never purchased. Miles delivered the conclusion personally, standing in the hangar doorway with the calm formality of a man observing the procedures of an outcome already decided. He told Evan the company would not pay. Then he offered him a smaller sum personally in exchange for a signed airworthiness certificate. Evan placed the hangar key on the workbench. His certified specialist identification stayed in his pocket. He told Miles that Ashcroft owned the aircraft, but no one in that building had the authority to declare it safe for flight. The next morning was clear and cold. Vivian arrived at Blackridge in a company car with a schedule requiring takeoff by 9. Miles informed her that Evan had abandoned the project after failing to extort additional payment, that the aircraft had been properly prepared for service, and that another technician's signature would be arranged within the hour. She entered the terminal believing the situation had been handled, that the delay had cost them nothing but a contract dispute, and that the inconvenience was over. She did not yet know that Captain Grant Hale had been in the hangar since 7:30. Grant was 55. He had flown Conrad Ashcroft across 6 continents and carried the particular professional gravity of a man who had spent 3 decades understanding that physics does not negotiate with pilots on behalf of schedules. He opened the maintenance log, read Evan's technical notes, observed the absence of a final airworthiness certificate, and set the log back on the table with the finality of a man whose decision had been made and would not be improved by further discussion. When Miles told him the certificate would be issued by the end of the day and that he could begin pre-flight preparations, Grant said he would begin pre-flight preparations when the certificate was issued, and that those two events were not interchangeable. Miles called the backup co-pilot. The co-pilot asked whether Evan Raw had released the aircraft for flight. When Miles said Raw was no longer involved, the co-pilot said he was unavailable for that departure. 2 contract pilots were called and offered double the standard rate. The first refused when dispatch mentioned an incomplete sign-off. The second came to the airfield, walked around the aircraft, read the maintenance log entry where Evan had recorded the unresolved anomaly in the control assembly, and left without stepping inside. Vivian asked Grant directly why he would not fly. Grant told her about a morning years earlier when he had arrived at the hangar and found a young aircraft technician refusing to let Conrad Ashcroft board his own plane until an irregular fuel delivery issue had been corrected. Conrad had dismissed the problem as minor. Evan had documented it in 3 pages of handwritten notes. The manufacturer later confirmed it as a known defect capable of causing engine failure in flight. Conrad had been furious. He had threatened Evan's job in front of witnesses and accused him of overstepping his authority. 2 weeks later, Conrad sent Evan a letter. Grant said he had never read it, but he had heard it described. From that day forward, Conrad trusted Evan's signature because he understood what it cost not to place it. Miles suggested finding an outside inspector who would issue the certificate on an accelerated basis. 3 candidates were contacted. Each said the same thing. When a technician of Evan Raw's level entered an open technical discrepancy into a maintenance log, no responsible inspector would sign over it without physically resolving the problem. Evan's entry was specific, documented, and tied to an unverifiable component serial number. It was the kind of entry that could not be dismissed without inspecting the component itself. The window for closing the merger was narrowing. A financial bulletin raised questions about whether the leadership transition at Ashcroft Meridian was proceeding smoothly. The board sent Vivian 3 messages before noon. Miles told her the situation was simply Evan holding the company hostage for a larger payout. Vivian stood in the terminal looking at the aircraft on the field and thought about the bolt Evan had placed on the tool cabinet, and about how the part numbers had not matched. She returned to the hangar alone. She opened a small personal locker built into the bulkhead behind the co-pilot seat, the one Conrad had always kept locked. Inside, beneath a folded navigation chart, lay a sealed envelope with a name written in her father's handwriting. Evan Raw. The letter consisted of 4 handwritten paragraphs on Ashcroft Meridian letterhead. It was dated 3 years before Conrad's death. He had written it after a maintenance inspection that, in his words, had opened his eyes to what he had allowed himself not to see. The tone was not corporate. It was a man writing something he intended to turn into action, though he had not yet decided when. Conrad wrote that the only reason any aircraft in his fleet remained airworthy was because there were still people in the maintenance chain who refused to treat their professional signatures as formalities. People who understood that certification did not exist to record that work had been done, but to guarantee that it had been done correctly. He wrote that such people were inconvenient, expensive, and absolutely necessary. and that any organization allowing pressure to be applied to them for the sake of compromise had already begun to rot, even if no one had noticed yet. The second item in the locker was a small voice recorder. When Vivian pressed play, she heard her father's voice in a quality that felt both wrong and right, too close and too immediate, filling the cabin with a presence that had been absent for 18 months. The recording was a conversation between Conrad and Miles, made approximately 8 weeks before Conrad's death. In it, Conrad asked, in the patient tone he used when he already knew the answer and was giving a man the chance to tell the truth before he reached it himself, why the aviation division's maintenance budget had increased by 31% in 3 years without any corresponding increase in fleet size or flight hours. Miles's explanation was smooth, detailed, and plausible. Conrad said he understood. Then, near the end of the recording, Conrad said he intended to request a full audit of every third-party vendor relationship in the aviation division after he returned from an upcoming international trip. The recording ended there. Conrad never returned from that trip. Vivian drove to Raw Airworks and found a bank foreclosure notice on the front door. Inside, Evan was packing tools into drawers with the quiet efficiency of a man who had decided to keep moving because stopping would improve nothing. She told him about the letter and the recording. She said she was ready to pay the invoice immediately and ask him to return and complete the certification. Evan set down the wrench he was holding and told her that his signature covered the entire aircraft, including every component installed before he arrived. Payment could not change the origin of a flight control component that could not be traced to any legitimate source. She asked what he needed. He said he needed an independent inspection organization with no connection to Ashcroft Meridian's procurement chain, a complete traceability review for every flight-critical component, and full payment to his team regardless of the inspection results. He said the problem was not the work he had performed. The problem was the work performed before him, work someone had tried to hide inside his own. He spread copies across the desk, serial number records, Wingard invoices, falsified engineer signatures, timestamp data showing server deletions, the original contract beside the altered version. She stood there reading for 20 minutes while he continued packing. Vivian told him she had signed the order to stop payment. He said he knew. She waited for some expression of anger, but none came. He only asked whether she had also read the information he had been looking at from the beginning, or only the version Miles wanted her to see. When she looked at everything laid out on that desk, she understood that those were two completely different things. She took out her phone and called the chairman of the board. Vivian did not confront Miles that evening. She had watched enough of how he operated to understand that direct confrontation before the evidence was secured would lead to controlled destruction of whatever remained. She told the chairman only that she was initiating an internal audit and needed 48 hours. Miles learned through some channel he maintained inside the board that she was slowing the process. He interpreted it as uncertainty and acted accordingly. He ordered the stored Wingard components removed from the hangar storage room and arranged for them to be transported to an off-airfield facility. Lena, who had been granted access to the independent auditor's tracking system, noticed the transport slip when it appeared. The auditors intercepted the delivery at a warehouse registered to a limited liability company whose only listed officer was Miles Voss's brother-in-law. Inside, investigators found 312 components across 17 categories. None had valid airworthiness certification. Many had counterfeit manufacturer markings. All were tied to Ashcroft Meridian payment documents covering 4 years. The markup on each item averaged 260% compared with equivalent legitimate parts. Miles had prepared for questions about procurement to arise in a legal context, where documents could be explained and timelines disputed. He was not prepared for those questions to arise in a boardroom, with Vivian Ashcroft seated at the head of the table and her father's recorder in front of her. He tried to deliver the explanation he had prepared. The components were legitimate alternatives from a supplier working outside ordinary channels. The pricing reflected accelerated availability. Raw Airworks itself had used unauthorized parts, the very same parts now found in the hangar storage room. He said that last part with confidence because he had put the parts there himself. Evan brought the hangar access log. Every entry into the storage room had been timestamped, including the entry made by Miles's technician the previous evening, several hours after Evan submitted his invoice. The parts had appeared after the invoice. Evan's installation record showed every component actually used on the aircraft, with matching documentation for each one. The gap between what Miles had planted and what had been installed was a gap Miles could not explain without explaining a midnight visit. Miles changed tactics and addressed the board directly. He reminded them that Evan had been fired from a larger firm 7 years earlier, that his business had a history of contract disputes, and that his financial difficulties gave him every reason to create a crisis. Evan said the firing was real, and the reason was documented too. He had refused to certify a batch of components purchased from an unapproved supplier. He had been asked to revise the inspection report. He refused and was fired. 11 months later, that firm recalled the entire batch of components after a federal aviation investigation. The documentation was on page 12 of the materials already provided to the board. Miles had no answer for page 12. Vivian suspended Miles pending the outcome of the investigation, authorized payment, and opened a full procurement audit. Then the auditors added the detail that changed the shape of everything. The suspicious class of components Lena had flagged on the Gulfstream had also been installed on 2 other aircraft in Ashcroft Meridian's private fleet. Both had flown dozens of trips during the previous 18 months. Vivian grounded the entire private fleet before the board meeting ended. She made the call herself from the conference room, and the flight operations coordinator confirmed the restriction within 60 seconds. The decision brought immediate and substantial financial consequences. Executive schedules were cancelled. International meetings had to be moved. It was a publicly visible operational disruption that financial journalists would notice before the end of trading. 3 board members told her she was overreacting. She told them that overreaction would be installing verified safe components before the next flight, and that she was willing to discuss any other interpretation once the inspection was complete. Miles offered his resignation that evening in a voicemail wrapped in language about the company's best interests, with the unspoken assumption that a quiet departure would suit both sides. Resignation was better than investigation. Certain facts could remain internal if the matter were treated as personnel-related. Vivian forwarded the voicemail to outside counsel and instructed them to coordinate with federal aviation authorities. Evan and Lena spent 2 days inspecting the 2 remaining aircraft with the same systematic attention they had given the Gulfstream. They found the same class of components in the flight control systems of both aircraft, the same origin from Wingard, the same lack of traceable certification, the same installation pattern during maintenance windows that had not been properly documented. Neither aircraft had failed yet, likely because both had been flown less intensively. But Evan's inspection notes were specific about what such a failure would look like at cruising altitude, and why no pilot would receive enough warning before it mattered. Several board members argued that Evan was positioning himself to receive a long-term contract from the crisis, that his refusal to certify before every component had been checked was leverage, not necessity. Evan asked the board to accept his resignation from the project, effective after all documentation had been handed over to the independent auditors. The room went quiet because no one had expected him to say that. He explained that his interest in the outcome was not commercial. The pilots who had flown those 2 other aircraft, and every passenger they had carried, had not been party to any of the decisions that had placed them at risk. They deserved the same evaluation every aircraft deserved before anyone put a signature beneath it. Vivian authorized full payment of $240,000, plus applicable late payment interest, plus reimbursement of every personal advance Evans' team had made during the project. She signed the authorization in the presence of the auditors, the board of directors, and Evans' team. She did not demand a non-disclosure agreement, because Evan had already told her he would not sign one. The merger Miles had tried to protect collapsed when the counterparty's due diligence team discovered the fleet grounding. Vivian had already decided that a merger built on a hidden safety threat was not a deal she was willing to complete. When Evan performed the final inspection of the Gulfstream's control assembly, he found a wear groove inside the linkage housing. It was deep, distinctive, and consistent with the gradual failure mode of a component rated incorrectly for sustained load. If the aircraft had departed that morning when Vivian ordered the flight, the system most likely would have shown its first symptoms somewhere over Virginia, at altitude, with no runway within reach. The wear groove was photographed, measured, and added to the official report without dramatization. But its presence confirmed what Evan had known from the first night he looked at the aircraft's maintenance history. Someone had prioritized speed over verification, and the gap between schedule and catastrophe had been far narrower than anyone in the executive tower understood. Grant stood beside Evan while the measurements were recorded and said nothing for a long time. Then he said Evan had been right when he put the logbook down. Evan said the decision had not required courage. It had required reading. Grant said, without irony, that he had met a great many people who could not manage both at the same time. Vivian apologized to every member of Evan's team personally and directly, using neither legal language nor the polished tone of corporate communications. She said she had been given a picture of the situation that served someone else's purpose, that she had acted on it without asking the right questions, and that she intended to build a reporting structure in which the right questions could be asked without professional consequences. Lena accepted the apology with a directness that made it neither easier nor harder than it was. The two technicians accepted it and went back to work because there was still work to do. Evan told Vivian that the most important mistake had not been trusting Miles. It had been creating, or allowing, an environment in which Miles could operate for years, while no one in the maintenance chain felt protected enough to file a formal complaint. She asked how to fix that. He said the fix was not a policy document. It was demonstrated behavior over time from the person at the top. She asked whether he would lead the aviation safety function. He said he would not take a position inside the structure from which he had been independent. The value of that independence was exactly what she had just finished learning. She would erase the lesson the moment she absorbed him into the hierarchy. He agreed instead to a formal independent inspector relationship for Raw Airworks, with a direct reporting line to the board and no routing through operations management. The arrangement was documented and signed the following week. The bank received full payment and released the lien on Evan's property. Evan repaid the quiet loan Lena had made to the business during the final weeks of the project, the one she had never mentioned and he had discovered only by reviewing the accounts in detail. Lena said it had been a business decision. Evan said he knew it had not. She said, "Fine." And that was the end of it. The replacement components arrived, certified, traceable, and documented to the standard Evan personally verified before authorizing installation. When the work was complete and the final inspection sequence had been passed, he stood in the cockpit looking at the instrument panel, at the small clock with its cleaned glass still fixed in place. Then he signed the airworthiness certificate. Not because Vivian Ashcroft held a title. Not because payment had arrived. Not because any schedule demanded it. He signed because the aircraft was safe, and because that was the only condition under which his signature had ever meant anything. Grant approached the aircraft first and settled into the left seat without ceremony, beginning the pre-flight checklist with the unhurried attention of a man who had learned exactly which things could be trusted. The pilots who had refused to fly weeks earlier arrived at the airfield without being called and submitted their flight documents without prompting, because the signature on the release form was the only instrument of confidence any of them had ever needed. When the Gulfstream reached the threshold of the runway and its engines came up to take off power, Evan stood at the edge of the field and waited for the moment the wheels left the ground. The aircraft lifted cleanly from the runway and climbed without hesitation into the morning sky above Charlotte. The sound of its engines faded in one long, clean arc until the Gulfstream became a silhouette against the high clouds, doing exactly what it had been built to do. Grant flew it through a full systems evaluation for 2 hours. Every surface, every backup channel, every automated response. It operated without deviation. When he entered final approach and touched down, the landing was the kind no one onboard comments on because there is nothing to comment on. And that absence of drama was the best possible outcome for everything that had happened before it. Grant came down the aircraft stairs, shook Evan's hand, and said the jet was ready to take Vivian anywhere she needed to go. The word anywhere carried the weight of everything it had taken to make it true. Vivian handed Evan a paper check for the full invoice amount in front of the remaining staff and the audit team. Evan reminded her that the bank transfer had cleared 2 days earlier. She said she knew. The check, she said, would be framed in the boardroom beneath a small brass plaque engraved with one line. No schedule, contract, or executive authority stands above the safety of this aircraft. In the months that followed, Raw Airworks expanded quietly. A second technician was hired. A larger diagnostic suite was installed. A formal independent inspection agreement was signed with a regional carrier that had heard about the Ashcroft case through the industry's efficient and unofficial information network. Vivian kept her position as chief executive not by controlling the story of what had happened, but by making operational changes visible to everyone in the organization, and by showing up herself at maintenance facilities without staff or prepared agendas, asking questions, and listening to the answers. She came to the shop on an early spring Thursday carrying 2 cups of coffee and no appointment. She and Evan sat for a while in the small office beside the main floor, talking about nothing in particular. Nora called during the conversation. When Evan returned, he mentioned that his daughter had observed that a chief executive personally delivering coffee to a repair shop and staying for 2 hours might have interests that extended beyond professional oversight. Vivian asked what he had told her. Evan said he had said nothing. Vivian said she had also said nothing. Then she picked up a coffee and looked through the office window at the hangar floor, where a new aircraft sat open and waiting. A man walked through the door carrying a folded set of maintenance records and asked Evan how long it would take to make his aircraft fly again. Evan looked into the logbook, turned 3 pages, and said what he always said. "I'm not paid to make it take off. I'm paid to make sure it comes back."